So this far in class, we've been looking at what happens when markets are fully functional. In this screen recording and in our next screen recording, we're going to look at what happens when markets fail. And there's a couple of different types of market failures that we need to examine. The first is an externality. Okay, so if you remember, Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand, which leads to self-interested buyers and sellers acting what's in their own interest, ends up maximizing total benefits for society. However, it's important to note, despite Adam Smith's invisible hand, market failures still occur, right? Sometimes the market isn't fully functional. So the first form of market failure we're going to look at in this unit is an externality. An externality is simply when one person's actions affect the people around them. These could be either positive or negative. They generally tend to cause markets to be inefficient because people don't generally care too much about how their actions affect their bystanders, and they tend to underestimate the influence that they're having on society as a whole. As a consequence, total surplus ends up not being maximized. Okay, so kind of like dead weight loss. Now, if the effect on bystanders is adverse, the externality is said to be negative. If the effect is beneficial, the externality is said to be positive. Right? If the costs are being passed on to society, it's a negative externality. If the benefits are being passed on to society, it's a positive externality. Some good examples of negative externalities: automobile exhaust, gum under your desk. So when you get to class tomorrow, I want you to look under your desk and see if there's any gum stuck under there. Loud pets, especially in like an apartment building, loud stereos in an apartment building, babies crying on airplanes, all examples of negative externalities, right? The people who own these products, the people who are the parents of the baby or the owners of the pet, don't generally worry too much about how their actions are affecting their bystanders. Now, some positive externalities include but not limited to immunizations. We'll talk in class about how immunizations are related to positive externalities, restoring buildings, research into new technology, and even things as simple as landscaping. Kind of my favorite example, actually. So if we landscape our front yard, we'll receive some of the benefits, right? But some of the benefits are also then passed on to my neighbor. So we're going to focus at first on negative externalities. Negative externalities lead to markets to be inefficient because what ends up happening is the market ends up producing a quantity larger than is socially desirable. Positive externalities lead the market to be inefficient by producing a quantity that is smaller than is socially desirable. So when we focus on externalities, we're going to look at, just for example, the market for aluminum. Okay, so the production of aluminum creates a known byproduct called dioxin. Dioxin is a known carcinogen. This is a cancer-causing agent. Okay, so it's an inevitable byproduct of the production of aluminum. Some dioxin will be released into the atmosphere. Now, that doesn't mean we should ban the production of aluminum. Aluminum is a very, very valuable commodity. It's used in all kinds of different applications, and it provides all kinds of different benefits to society. However, what it does mean is the aluminum producers don't generally care about the dioxin they emit. Okay, so when we look at the market for aluminum, the private cost and the private value are represented by the supply and demand. The point where they intersect will give us our market quantity at equilibrium. Okay. However, the dioxin is actually a social cost. So what happens when you have a negative externality is the supply curve shifts upward by the size of the negative externality. So however large the negative externality, the supply curve will end up shifting upward, right? And this will give us our social cost. which is both the private cost and the external cost. And this will lead us to our optimal quantity. This is if we were to take into consideration not just the cost of the action, the cost of production, but also the external cost of action. This would be the quantity that we would ideally see produced. Now, the intersection of the demand curve and the social cost curve will show us our optimal quantity. And generally, when there's a negative externality, the socially optimal level of output is going to be less than the equilibrium level. Okay, so when I look at it, socially optimal quantity is going to be right here. That's going to be significantly less than the equilibrium quantity. Another great example of negative externalities, smoking, right? If people take into consideration the external cost of secondhand smoke, there would be far fewer smokers. Now, generally speaking, the goal of policymakers is to alter the incentive so people will do what's called internalizing the externality. Take into consideration their external cost of production. Okay? The easiest way with a negative externality to internalize the externality is through a tax. So a tax will shift the supply curve upward by the size of the external cost. Okay? So you impose a tax, that'll shift the supply curve upward, which will lead to the market quantity declining closer to the optimal quantity. And if you think of things that generally cause negative externalities, they're often things that are heavily taxed. For example, smoking, as I mentioned earlier, gasoline for cars. Cars cause pollution, particularly problems with acid rain. Another example, alcohol causes lots of negative externalities. These are all products that are heavily taxed by the government. Now, when an externality benefits a bystander, it's a positive externality. Okay? So the social value is higher than the private value. So there's lots of examples of positive externalities. Probably one of the best examples is education. Okay? So when somebody gets educated, the benefit is to themselves, but there are also benefits to society. You have a more informed electorate. You have technology spillovers where they develop new ideas, they work better, they're better taxpayers. There's all kinds of benefits to education. Now, if people were left alone to pay for their own education, the point where the private cost and the private value, the supply and demand intersect, would give us our equilibrium quantity. However, there are additional benefits to education. So what happens is the public benefit, the external benefit, shifts the demand curve upward. And what we see is the socially optimal quantity is higher than the market quantity. So we actually want to encourage people to produce more things that create positive externalities. So the intersection of the supply and social value curve will determine our optimal level. Okay? The market, if left alone, is going to produce a smaller quantity than is socially desirable. To internalize externalities, the government has a couple of different functions, a couple of different methods they can use. Now, when it comes to education and many other private positive externalities, probably the easiest method is through what are called subsidies. Okay, this is the primary method, right? This is used to attempt to get people to take into consideration the positive externalities. So when you think of things that create positive externalities, there's often some form of government subsidy. So for example, if you buy an energy efficient appliance, you could get a tax rebate. If you go to college, the government might subsidize your student loan, right? Government's going to use subsidies, they're going to use money to attempt to get you to produce more things that create positive externalities. Now, when it comes to industry, the government can also use what's called industrial policy. This is the idea that the government might try to promote technology, and they could use this through patents, copyrights, intellectual property rights, things we've talked about it before when we talked about natural monopolies and government-created monopolies. Now, when it comes to negative externalities, Private solutions aren't, or pardon me, public solutions, government solutions aren't actually generally the most effective or always the most effective. There are lots of different private ways where people can actually solve the problems of negative externalities. So different types of private solutions to public problems. Probably the most effective, moral codes and social sanctions. Um, this is why people don't generally do everything they want the minute that they want to. They take into consideration oftentimes how their actions affect other people. It's why I don't dump toxic sludge in my backyard, or part of the reason why. When it comes to the negative externality of poverty, charitable organizations, we can also talk about business integration. This is more for positive externalities. And then contracting between parties. And this is known as the Coase theorem. So the Coase theorem is named after the University of Chicago economist Ronald Coase. He won the Nobel Prize for this idea. And it's the idea that private individuals, if they have an opportunity, they can actually bargain about the problems of externalities. We'll do a Coase theorem problem in class, kind of explain it in a little bit more detail. Okay, the Coase theorem is generally effective. It will sometimes fail. Okay, there are a couple of reasons the Coase theorem might fail. One of the big reasons is transaction costs. Generally speaking, for the Coase theorem to be effective, the private parties have to sign contracts about how they're going to behave. In order to sign in order to create a legally binding contract, they have to have lawyers, and oop, the lawyers wind up costing them so much money that it becomes difficult to actually negotiate a private solution. And again, we're going to do some Coase theorem problems in class, maybe explain this a little more detail. When negative externalities are present and when they're significant, okay, and private solutions can't be negotiated, or when the number of interested parties is really large, like something like widespread environmental pollution, okay, so there's so many people involved you really can't find a private solution, the government will often have to step in and try to solve the problem. And they can do this through two different approaches. The first is command and control policies. The second is market-based policies. Okay, so a command and control policy usually takes the form of rules and regulations. For example, the government can forbid certain behaviors or require certain behaviors. So the government requires that all students be immunized, right? The reason is, well, we'll talk about the immunization rules in class, but the reason is some students can't be immunized due to health problems, and they actually benefit from what's called herd immunization. So the fact that the entire group is immunized, that actually protects those people. Or the government might put in rules about how much pollution can be emitted. Now, market-based incentives kind of take a couple of different varieties. Um, the government can try to use a regulation limiting the amount of pollution. Another way the government can engage, though, is through what's called a corrective tax. Okay? So, corrective taxes are used to eliminate the problems of negative externalities. So when the government puts in place a corrective tax, what they're attempting to do, so here's my really crude diagram of a negative externality. Okay, so they're currently producing at equilibrium right here. Now we have our social cost added on. Okay, right, the corrective tax attempts to force the firm to take into consideration the cost of the negative externality. Corrective taxes are also called Pigovian taxes. The tax on cigarettes is an example of a corrective tax, right? It's designed to make people take into consideration the cost of their actions. Now there is an alternate solution called tradable pollution permits, which is the notion that the government, this is especially for carbon pollution, okay? This is an idea for how you can possibly reduce pollution to combat global warming. Um, and it's the idea that firms can purchase from the government a permit that will allow them to pollute. If they find ways to save, they can then sell their permit to other companies, right? There's going to be a resale market for these permits. So firms that find ways to cut down on pollution will find it beneficial. They can purchase their permits, they can then sell them to other companies, and they're going to save money in their production. Now, a corrective tax is going to look like this. So here we have our demand for pollution. There's our tax. Wherever the tax and the demand intersect, that's going to be our quantity of pollution. Now, environmentalists sometimes worry about corrective taxes because if the demand for the product increases, what's going to happen is the quantity of pollution emitted is going to increase, right? So the concern with corrective taxes is it doesn't put a cap on the amount of actual pollution you can emit. Okay, so this is very concerning to environmentalists. Um, Environmentalists generally tend to prefer the tradable pollution permits, which is actually also called a cap and trade system. So the way tradable pollution permits looks like is this. Here's your demand for the right to pollute. Companies want to pay a price to pollute so they can produce products. The government then limits the number of pollution permits, and wherever the demand and the quantity intersect, that's going to determine the price. Now, what happens here if the demand increases? Instead of the quantity increasing, the price increases. Okay? So under the corrective tax, the problem is you don't fix the quantity of pollution. Under the tradable pollution permit or the cap and trade system, you do fix the level of pollution. The negative to this system is it could raise the price. It's not the most flexible system, and there are some potential for abuses. Now, definitely make sure you take a few minutes and look over, especially this last section about the corrective tax and the tradable pollution permits in your textbook.